So up until this point, we've mostly talked about French politics in the 1920s. We haven't really understood why exactly the French called the 1920s the crazy years, or l'année folle, the crazy years of the 1920s. I have talked several times about the crisis facing the French franc in the 1920s, but it would be a mistake to assume that the French economy in general did very badly in the 1920s. In fact, exactly like the United States, the post-war era in general was quite one of economic prosperity for France. And one reason, ironically, was indeed the falling value of the franc. As you obviously understand, with the value of the franc declining, that was an enormous stimulus to French exporters who were trying to export their goods overseas. For the first time in essentially history, France achieved a positive trade balance with Germany. Of course, this was obviously helped by the fact that the French could send their goods tariff-free into Germany. French industrial production increased in terms of iron production. The French finally caught up to the British over the course of the 1920s. So yeah, the French economy did quite well in many regards in the 1920s. It was also, of course, helped by the fact that in the rebuilding efforts to restore the destroyed territories of northeastern France, that obviously provided a considerable stimulus to the French economy as well. One industry in which the French were still quite proficient was the automobile industry. By the end of the 1920s, the French automobile industry was producing 250,000 cars a year, making it the second largest producer of automobiles around the world, although that paled in comparison against the United States, which was producing 5.5 million cars at the same time. So compared to the United States, perhaps not all that impressive, but certainly was worth noting that the French auto industry was one area in which France was something of a global leader. As in the United States, as in most of the Western world, professional marketing played an important role in the French economy in the 1920s, helping stimulate desire to purchase goods. Then, as now oftentimes sexualized femininity was used to sell products, as we see here, cigarettes and raisins being sold by alongside images of attractive women, in the hope of stimulating kind of subconscious desires to encourage people to publish or to purchase these products. So marketing techniques from the United States were coming into France, but in many ways the French industrial sector was also copying aspects of American industrial output. The French term fourrisme, that is the production line, came into France in the 1920s, reflecting the fact that Henry Ford's successful use of assembly lines was now being copied by French factories. And another important development, kind of related to fourrisme, as it were, I'm going to give you a question. So this engineer who promoted efficiency published the Principles of Scientific Management in 1911. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but this is Frederick Winslow Taylor, the famous the person after whom Taylorism was named, that efficiently managing the physical output of the amount of work your workers could do in any given day. This became known as, in France, as Taylorisme. So there we have Taylor Swift there with Taylorisme. Again, the French managers were paying more attention to how to maximize productivity from their workers. So French industry was borrowing a lot from the United States. But this caused something of a concern among some people in France. You're probably aware today that in France there is often a pushback against adopting things that are seen as too English-speaking, too much part of the English-speaking world, or perhaps too American in particular. That first concern raised its head in the 1920s in response to the changing world of work in France, fourrisme, Taylorisme. And one of the most kind of obvious examples of this was the publication of a book in the late 1920s by George Duhamel, America the Menace, Scenes from Life of the Future. So Duhamel spent time in the United States, traveled to the United States, and he felt he had seen something of the future for where France might be headed if it continued to adopt American industrial values. And Duhamel was not a fan. He basically said, and we'll give the quote here, "What strikes the European traveller is the progressive approximation of human life to what we know of the way of life of insects, the same effacement of the individual, the same progressive reduction and unification of social types." So in other words, he's saying that individuality is lost, in some ways liberty is being lost, by adopting these American approaches to labor, are essentially becoming like bees in a beehive, or insects, and the finer things in life are being lost out because of this adopting of American culture. So that was the beginning point of a trend in France where there was considerable pushback against American culture, and this was to continue into the 21st century, into our day and age today. That being said, there were other aspects in which American culture was obvious in France. The rise of movie theaters, of cinemas, helped introduce mass culture to France, and some of it was influenced, of course, by American culture as well. We mentioned in an earlier lecture that the French film industry had been quite successful before the First World War. After the Second World War, it had been unable to compete largely with new American movie productions. So while French industry kind of maybe took something of a step back in the 1920s, French consumption of movies certainly increased dramatically, and the widespread of movie theaters across France was a sign of this. Another agent of mass culture in France, of course, was the introduction of the radio, which began to be popularized in the 1920s as well. The French state was kind of initially somewhat at a loss of how it should approach broadcasting, and radio broadcasting in particular, whether it should adopt the American model of simply allowing private companies to manage it themselves, or adopt the British model in which the government supervised significantly broadcast radio, especially in the creation of the British Broadcasting Company, a government-run media outlet. Initially, the French government was kind of more standoffish and allowed private businesses to take the lead, but by the early 1930s had become more hands-on about trying to regain control of the broadcast market itself. In fact, one of the interesting innovations as a result of this was the rise of Radio Luxembourg. Radio Luxembourg became quite famous in the 20th century. It was established in Luxembourg in 1933, and the reason it was established in Luxembourg was to allow the radio show to broadcast into France, but evade French government restrictions on broadcasting, as the French government tried to kind of regain control or take control of the broadcast industry. There were also significant individuals who played an important role in the crazy years of France of 1921. Let's ask you a Jeopardy question. So, African American history. Born in Missouri, she was the first African American star of a major motion picture, The Call of the Siren from 1927, and was an iconic dancer in 1920s France. And the answer is, who is Josephine Baker? Perhaps you haven't heard of Josephine Baker, but she was a very successful young woman who moved to France when she was 19, and widely successful initially as a dancer in French clubs in Paris, and then as a movie star. So the image on the right, where Baker has the kind of this pointing her fingers, that was from The Call of the Siren, the first major movie she starred in. So Baker had a very successful career, lived actually almost the entire rest of her life in France, and was something of an icon back in the United States, especially amongst the African American community. Other examples of the kind of wild, or the emergence of a kind of a party lifestyle in France were perhaps best documented by Victor Marguerite's novel La Garçon, The Bachelorette, which he published in, I think it was 1927. This was basically supposed to be a window into the life of decadence amongst the youth of France in the 1920s, where we have, as you can see from the image, women smoking, which would have been quite shocking at the time, women having short bobbed hair, which was seen as a challenge to traditional concepts of femininity, widespread sex, alcohol consumption, drug consumption. To what extent your average French person lived this life, your average young French person, somewhat debatable. So it's probably a kind of exaggerated to some extent that probably only a minority of young French people truly live this kind of life of liberation, if you wish. But it did show that there was evolving trends towards free time and how one enjoyed oneself in France as well. Of course, the crazy years in France were often marked by an incredible array of talented foreigners who also lived in France, and helped kind of stimulate this France, or cement France's place as the cultural centre of the Western world in the 1920s. So let me just give you a couple of Jeopardy questions to demonstrate. So, American cities, when she said there was no there, Gertrude Stein was talking about this Western city. and that is Oakland. So Gertrude Stein spent most of the 1920s in France, and was something of a matriarch to many of the talented artists who lived in the city at that time. Another example of someone who worked with Gertrude Stein, who met her a few times in Paris, he wrote The Sun Also Rises while living in Paris in the 1920s, who is Ernest Hemingway. The next question I have for you: so this author completed Ulysses and wrote Finnegan's Wake during the 20 years he lived in Paris. And so if you don't have any idea, I'll give you a clue. My Irish bias is the reason I put this character in here, or this person in here. And if you don't know the answer, it is James Joyce. James Joyce, Ulysses, possibly the most significant novel in 20th century English literature, was written largely in Paris. Pablo Picasso was another famous artist. So France had a very rich artistic community during that time. And one interesting aspect of French culture in the 1920s was the emergence of what's called negritude, essentially growing awareness amongst black people living in France about what it meant to be black. African Americans, Josephine Baker was a good example, encountering people of African descent from French colonies, kind of brought about this interchange of ideas, this consumption of maybe more traditional colonial attitudes towards black identity, and trends in the United States, such as Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanism, and helped essentially create a growing confidence and a sense of importance around black identity. Two of the most important authors that kind of demonstrate this. So on the right we had Aimé Césaire, who was from Martinique in the Caribbean, and Léopold Senghor, who was from Senegal. So both of them migrated to France, eventually established pretty successful political careers in France, but also wrote about the need for people of African descent to take pride in their identity, to kind of claim their identity for themselves, and to kind of reject traditional white French attitudes towards what it meant to be black, and reject stereotypes in that sense. The 1920s was also a time of considerable change for women. France actually so in 1914 the Socialist Party had attempted to introduce the right of votes for women. They had almost successfully introduced it, but because the war got postponed. Interestingly, after the war, unlike most of the rest of Europe, the effort to introduce voting for women was stymied. It was stymied because radical Republicans, in particular, were afraid they didn't want women to vote. It was actually conservatives who were pushing the right for women to vote, not the more left-leaning parties. Why exactly was that? Well, basically, those on the left feared that women would be kind of led by the nose by clerics, by churchmen, and would all vote conservative. And given the fact that women were now in a clear majority in the population of France after the slaughter of the First World War, the many forces on the left felt that was too much of a gesture to make. And so women in France did not get to vote. It was not until actually during the end of the Second World War that French women were entitled to vote. So there were several campaigns demanding equality for women, demanding the vote for women. Many women made the point that Joan of Arc had saved France in the 15th century, and now but she couldn't essentially be a local city councillor in the 20th century France. But these efforts were, for the most part, unsuccessful because of the force on the left who refused to concede the vote to women. It should also be borne in mind that the feminism, as we would know it in France, expanded to accept more Catholic women's groups into its fold in the 1920s. And the major issue that people debated about femininity in France in the 20th century, 1920s, was around birth control. Obviously, the fall of the slaughter of the First World War, the declining birth rate, the French government felt a sense of urgency about introducing or increasing the birth rate, and their solution was to, in 1920, not only ban abortion, but also to outlaw the distribution of any information on birth control and any kind of birth control device, apart, of course, from condoms, because they wanted to protect men from venereal disease when they visited brothels. So that was France in the 1920s. I hope to give you some insight of some of the important changes that took place. And I will be back again with our next discussion of France and the Great Depression at a later time.